My daughter stood in the doorway of my living room, arms crossed, chin lifted like she was about to deliver a verdict I had no say in. My wife, the children, and the father-in-law are going to live here. They are cramped in the apartment. There's no point in complaining, it's already been decided. Her voice didn't waver. No apology, no negotiation, just certainty. And I stood there, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand, wondering when exactly I'd lost the right to decide who lived under the roof I'd built with my own sweat and savings. When had I become a footnote in my own home? She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel, grabbed her car keys from the counter, and left. The door clicked shut behind her with the kind of finality that makes your stomach drop. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space where she'd been, trying to process what had just happened. My daughter, the girl I'd raised alone after her mother passed. The same girl who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared her. Now she was making decisions about my life without so much as a conversation. Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. I set the coffee cup down on the kitchen table and walked over to the window. Outside, the morning light was soft and golden, washing over the garden I'd spent years tending. Rows of tomatoes, beds of roses, a small herb patch near the fence. Every inch of this place had my fingerprints on it. I'd bought this house 30 years ago, back when it was just a worn-down fixer-upper with peeling paint and a leaky roof. I'd patched every crack, painted every wall, replaced every broken floorboard. It wasn't just a house. It was a monument to everything I'd worked for. And now, apparently, it was about to become a crowded boarding house. I thought back to the last time I'd seen my daughter's in-laws. It was at her wedding, 3 years ago. Her father-in-law, a man named Gerald, had spent most of the reception complaining about the food, the music, the seating arrangements. He had this habit of speaking to people like they were beneath him, like every conversation was a chance to remind you that he knew better. I'd tolerated him for my daughter's sake, smiled politely, shook his hand, congratulated him on gaining a son-in-law. But even then, I'd felt a cold prickle of dislike. There was something in his eyes, a smugness, a sense of entitlement that made my skin crawl. And now he was coming to live here. I tried calling my daughter. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I even say? Please reconsider turning my home into a halfway house for your husband's family. It sounded bitter even in my head. I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood, tracing the patterns with my finger. I felt a tightness in my chest, something heavy and suffocating. Anger, maybe. Or grief. Or both. The hours passed slowly. I tried to distract myself. I went outside and pruned the roses, pulled a few weeds from the vegetable beds, watered the herbs. But my mind kept circling back to that moment in the doorway. The coldness in her voice, the way she didn't even look me in the eye. It wasn't just about the space. It was about respect, or the lack of it. By late afternoon, I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I looked up from the garden and saw my daughter's car pulling into the driveway. Behind it was a second car, an old sedan with a dented bumper and a cracked windshield. My stomach tightened. She'd brought them already. No warning, no time to prepare, just like she'd said. It was already decided. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands, and walked slowly toward the driveway. The car doors opened. My daughter stepped out first, her face unreadable. Then her husband, a quiet man who rarely spoke and seemed perpetually uncomfortable in his own skin. Then 2 small children, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 8 years old. They looked tired, their clothes rumpled, their eyes wide and uncertain. And finally, from the passenger seat of the second car, Gerald emerged. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered with graying hair combed back and a thick mustache that twitched when he smiled. He smiled now, wide and confident, like he was arriving at a resort he'd paid for. He stretched his arms above his head, cracked his knuckles, and looked around the property with an appraising eye. "Nice place," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. Bigger than I expected. I didn't respond. I just stood there, hands at my sides, waiting. My daughter walked over to me, her expression tight. "Dad, this is Gerald, my father-in-law, and this is his wife, Marjorie." A small woman with sharp features and a pursed mouth stepped out from the driver's seat. She didn't smile. She just nodded curtly in my direction like I was the help. "We appreciate you letting us stay," Gerald said, though his tone suggested he didn't really care whether I appreciated it or not. The apartment was getting too cramped. Kids need space to run around, and Marjorie's been having trouble with the stairs. Marjorie sniffed. "It's been hell." I looked at my daughter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Where should we put our things?" Gerald asked, already moving toward the trunk of the car. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say anything, my daughter cut in. "The guest room's upstairs. There's 2 of them. The kids can share one, and you and Marjorie can take the other." Gerald nodded, already hauling a suitcase out of the trunk. "Perfect." I watched them unload. Suitcases, boxes, bags of clothes, toys, a small television. They moved with the ease of people who'd already claimed the space. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just possession. And I stood there feeling like a stranger in my own home. By evening, the house was transformed. The guest rooms were filled with their belongings. The kids were running up and down the hallway, their laughter echoing off the walls. Marjorie was in the kitchen, rearranging my cabinets without asking, muttering about how disorganized everything was. And Gerald was in the living room, feet up on my coffee table, flipping through channels on the TV like he owned the place. I sat in the corner of the room, watching it all unfold, feeling invisible. My daughter came over and sat down next to me. For a moment I thought she might apologize, maybe explain, maybe acknowledge what she'd done. Instead, she said, "I know this is a lot, Dad, but it's temporary, just until they find a bigger place." "How long is temporary?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. "A few months, maybe 6. 6 months, half a year of this." I nodded slowly, swallowing the words I wanted to say. She patted my shoulder and stood up. "Thanks for understanding." But I didn't understand. Not at all. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of people moving through my house. Footsteps, voices, the creak of floorboards, and I realized something that made my chest ache. I'd spent my whole life building a home, and now in a single day it had stopped feeling like mine. The first morning I woke to the sound of shouting. Not angry shouting, just loud. Gerald's voice boomed through the walls like he was addressing a crowd instead of his grandchildren. "Breakfast is ready. Come on, move it." I checked the clock. 5:30 in the morning. The sun wasn't even up yet. I lay there for a moment, staring at the dim light creeping through the curtains, wondering if this was going to be my new normal. Wondering how long I could tolerate it before something inside me snapped. I got dressed and made my way downstairs. The kitchen was chaos. Marjorie was at the stove, frying eggs and bacon, muttering to herself about how small the pans were. The kids were at the table, cereal boxes open, milk spilled across the surface. Gerald sat at the head of the table, my usual spot, reading a newspaper he must have brought with him. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge me at all. I stood in the doorway, taking it all in, feeling like an intruder in my own space. "Morning," I said quietly. Marjorie glanced over her shoulder. "Coffee's on the counter. Made it strong. Harold likes it that way." Harold. She meant Gerald. I nodded and poured myself a cup, even though I preferred it milder. The taste was bitter, almost burnt. I forced it down anyway. My daughter appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She grabbed a piece of toast from the counter and kissed the kids on their heads. "Be good for Grandma and Grandpa," she said. Then she looked at me. "Thanks again, Dad. This really means a lot." And she was gone. Out the door before I could respond. Before I could ask her when exactly she planned to check in on how this arrangement was actually working. I sat down at the table in the only empty chair, squeezed between one of the kids and a stack of Gerald's mail. The boy, the younger one, looked up at me with wide eyes. "Are you our grandpa too?" he asked. "No," I said gently. "I'm your mom's dad." He tilted his head, processing that. "So you're like a different grandpa." "Something like that." Gerald folded his newspaper and set it down with a loud slap. "Kids, finish up. We're going to explore the yard after breakfast." He looked at me for the first time that morning. "You've got a lot of land here, must be a pain to maintain." "I manage," I said. He grunted. "Well, don't worry. I'll keep an eye on things. Make sure it doesn't go to hell." He said it like he was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. After breakfast, I retreated to the garage. It was the one place in the house that still felt like mine. Tools hanging on pegboards, cans of paint stacked neatly on shelves, the smell of sawdust and motor oil. I'd planned to work on a small bookshelf I'd been building for weeks, but I couldn't focus. My hands felt restless. My mind kept drifting back to the kitchen, to Gerald sitting in my chair, to Marjorie rearranging my things like I didn't know how to run my own home. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Gerald standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking around the garage with that same appraising expression he'd had when he first arrived. "You've got a nice setup here," he said. "You do carpentry?" "Woodworking," I said, "just as a hobby." He nodded, stepping further inside. He picked up one of my chisels, turning it over in his hands like he was inspecting it. I used to do some work with my hands too, back before my knees went bad. He set the chisel down, not in the spot where I'd had it, and leaned against my workbench. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you, man to man." I waited. "I know this situation isn't ideal," he said, "but Marjorie and we're not freeloaders. We're going to contribute, help out around here. You won't even know we're here." I almost laughed. I'd already heard them in every corner of the house, already felt their presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. But I kept my face neutral. "I appreciate that," I said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Glad we understand each other." He pushed off the workbench and started to leave, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. Marjorie's going to need the kitchen most mornings. She likes to cook big breakfasts for the family. I hope that's not a problem." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "No problem," I said, even though my jaw was tight. He clapped me on the shoulder and walked out. The days blurred together after that. Gerald and Marjorie settled in like they'd always lived there. The kids ran wild through the house, knocking over picture frames, leaving toys scattered across the floors. Marjorie took over the kitchen completely, reorganizing everything to suit her needs, throwing out things she deemed unnecessary. My favorite coffee mug, the one my late wife had given me, disappeared. I found it later in a box in the garage, packed away with other items Marjorie had decided I didn't need. I didn't say anything. I just put it back in the cupboard. But she moved it again the next day. Gerald, meanwhile, made himself the unofficial manager of the property. He started giving me advice I didn't ask for, told me the lawn needed mowing more often, suggested I trim back the hedges, complained that the water pressure in the upstairs bathroom was too weak. Every comment felt like a small erosion of my authority, a reminder that this was no longer just my space. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, trying to read, when Gerald came in and turned on the television without asking. He flipped to a news channel, volume loud enough to rattle the windows. I glanced up from my book. "Do you mind turning that down a bit?" I asked. He looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "What?" "The volume. It's a little loud." He frowned. "I can barely hear it. I'm trying to read." He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged and turned it down. By one notch, barely noticeable. Then he settled into the armchair, my armchair, and put his feet up. I closed my book and went upstairs. That night, lying in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A deep, hollow loneliness, the kind that makes your chest ache. I was surrounded by people, my house full of noise and movement, and yet I'd never felt more alone. I thought about calling my daughter, telling her how I really felt. But every time I imagined the conversation, I saw her face, that tight expression, the way she'd looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like I was the problem. So I didn't call. The breaking point came 3 weeks in. I was in the garden pulling weeds from the vegetable beds when I heard a crash from inside the house. I dropped my tools and ran inside. In the living room, one of the kids had knocked over a lamp. Not just any lamp. The ceramic one my wife had made in a pottery class years ago. It was shattered on the floor, pieces scattered across the hardwood. The boy stood frozen, staring at the mess, his face pale. Marjorie appeared in the doorway, hands on her hips. "It was an accident," she said quickly. "Kids will be kids." I knelt down and picked up one of the larger pieces. The base was cracked clean in half. Irreparable. I felt a tightness in my throat, not just sadness, rage, hot and sudden. "He needs to be more careful," I said quietly. Marjorie's expression hardened. "He's 6 years old. Accidents happen." That lamp meant something to me. She shrugged. "It's just a thing. Just a thing." I stared at her, at the casual dismissal in her eyes, and something inside me shifted. I stood up slowly, still holding the broken piece, and walked past her without another word. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking. I realized in that moment that this wasn't temporary. This wasn't just a few months of inconvenience. This was my daughter choosing them over me, choosing their comfort over my peace. And I didn't know if I had the strength to fight it. But I also didn't know if I could keep living like this. What would you have done if your own child made you feel like a stranger in your own home? I stopped eating breakfast with them. It was easier that way. I'd wake up earlier than everyone else before the sun crept over the hills, and make myself a simple meal in the quiet dark. Toast. Coffee the way I liked it. Then I'd slip out to the garage or the garden before the house came alive with their noise. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Those early hours became sacred. The only time I could breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. But even that small sanctuary didn't last long. One morning, about a month after they'd moved in, I came downstairs at 5 to find Gerald already in the kitchen. He was wearing a bathrobe I didn't recognize, standing at the counter making himself a sandwich. He looked up when I entered, mustard knife in hand, and grinned. "Early bird, huh?" he said. "I'm the same way. Can't sleep past 5 anymore. Knees start aching if I stay in bed too long." I nodded and moved toward the coffee maker, hoping he'd finish and leave. But he didn't. He kept talking. About his knees. About the weather. About a documentary he'd watched the night before. His voice filled the kitchen like smoke, thick and inescapable. I poured my coffee and stood there, trapped, listening to him ramble while my quiet morning dissolved into nothing. When he finally left, I realized my hands were clenched so tight around the mug that my knuckles had turned white. That afternoon, my daughter stopped by. She didn't come inside. Just pulled into the driveway, left the engine running, and waved me over. I walked out to meet her, wiping grease from my hands. I'd been fixing a hinge on the garage door. "Hey, Dad," she said through the open window. "Just checking in. How's everything going?" I looked back at the house. Through the window, I could see Marjorie in the kitchen, talking on the phone, gesturing wildly with her free hand. Gerald was in the living room, feet up, television blaring. The kids were somewhere upstairs, their footsteps pounding across the ceiling like drumbeats. "Fine," I said. She studied my face for a moment, and I thought maybe she saw through the lie. Maybe she'd ask more. Maybe she'd actually care. But she just smiled. "Good. I knew you'd all get along. Gerald said you've been really accommodating." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You're the best, Dad." I'll see you this weekend." And then she drove off. I stood there in the driveway, watching her taillights disappear down the road, and felt something crack inside me. Not anger, not sadness, just emptiness. Like I'd been hollowed out and there was nothing left to break. The next few days were worse. Gerald started treating the house like it was his. He rearranged the furniture in the living room without asking, saying it had better feng shui. He invited his friends over for poker night, filling my dining room with cigar smoke and loud laughter that lasted until 2 in the morning. Marjorie began redecorating, hanging up her own pictures, moving mine to the hallway or the closet. My wedding photo, the one that had sat on the mantel for 30 years, ended up in a drawer. I found it there one evening while searching for a screwdriver. I pulled it out and stared at it, my wife's face frozen in time smiling up at me. I remembered the day that photo was taken, the way her hand felt in mine, the way she'd laughed when I'd stepped on her dress during our first dance. I put the photo back on the mantel. The next morning it was gone again. I didn't bother looking for it. One night I couldn't sleep. The house was too loud. Even at midnight I could hear the television downstairs, the low murmur of Gerald and Marjorie talking, the creak of footsteps in the hallway. I got out of bed and went to the window. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the garden. I stared out at the rows of vegetables, the rose bushes, the small patch of herbs near the fence. It all looked so peaceful, so untouched. And then I saw him. Gerald was in the garden, in the dark. He was walking through the rows, stepping on the plants, crushing them under his feet. At first I thought it was an accident, that he didn't realize what he was doing. But then I saw him bend down and yank a tomato plant out of the ground, roots and all, and toss it aside like garbage. My heart started pounding. I pulled on my shoes and hurried downstairs, moving as quietly as I could. I slipped out the back door and crossed the yard. The grass was damp under my feet, cold and slick with dew. "What are you doing?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. Gerald turned, startled. He had dirt on his hands smeared across his bathrobe. "Oh, didn't hear you come out." He gestured at the garden. "I was just clearing some space. Marjorie wants to plant flowers. Roses are nice, but she's thinking tulips, maybe some daisies." "This is a vegetable garden," I said. My voice was shaking. "I've been working on it for years." He shrugged. "Yeah, but you've got plenty of vegetables, and honestly, it's looking a little messy. Flowers would clean it up, make it look nicer." I stared at him, at the uprooted plants, at the dirt scattered across the ground. "You didn't ask." "Well, I figured it'd be a nice surprise." He smiled, that same wide, confident smile, like he'd done me a favor. I felt something rising in my chest, something hot and sharp. "Put them back." His smile faded. "What?" "Put the plants back." He laughed, short and dismissive. "Come on, they're just plants. We'll get you new ones." "Put them back," I said again, louder this time. He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not guilt, not understanding, annoyance. All right, he said, holding up his hands. "Relax. I didn't know you'd get so worked up about it." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the plants where they were, leaving the mess for me to deal with. I stood there in the dark, surrounded by the ruins of my garden, and felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I hadn't cried in years, not since my wife's funeral. But now, standing in the cold night air, staring at the plants I'd nurtured and cared for, torn up and discarded like they meant nothing, I felt the tears come. I knelt down and tried to replant what I could. My hands shook as I pressed the roots back into the soil, but I knew it was useless. The damage was done. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet. Gerald and Marjorie had gone to bed. I sat at the kitchen table, still covered in dirt, and stared at the wall. I thought about my daughter, about how she'd looked at me in the driveway, how she'd smiled and said I was the best. I thought about my wife, and how she'd always told me to stand up for myself, to never let people walk over me. I thought about the life I'd built in this house, and how, piece by piece, it was being taken away. The next morning, I didn't go to the garage. I didn't go to the garden. I sat in my bedroom, door closed, and made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. I pulled out my phone and started searching. Apartments, small places. Somewhere I could go where I wouldn't feel like a ghost in my own home. I scrolled through listings, feeling a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. Relief that there was a way out. Heartbreak that it had come to this. That my own daughter had pushed me to the point where leaving felt like the only option. But then I stopped. I set the phone down and looked around my bedroom. At the furniture I'd built. At the photos on the walls. At the window that overlooked the garden I'd spent decades cultivating. And I realized something. This was my home. I'd poured my life into it. And I'd be damned if I was going to let them drive me out. But what could I do? They weren't leaving. My daughter wasn't going to side with me, and I couldn't exactly throw them out. Could I? Do you think I was wrong to even consider it? I sat there for a long time, staring at the walls, feeling something harden inside me. I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to keep disappearing into corners of my own house. I wasn't going to keep swallowing my words and pretending everything was fine. If they wanted to stay, they were going to have to face the man whose home they'd invaded. And I wasn't going to make it easy anymore. I decided to take a trip. Just 3 days. A small cabin 2 hours north that I'd rented online, tucked away in the woods near a lake. I told no one. Not my daughter. Not Gerald or Marjorie. I just packed a bag early one morning, left a note on the kitchen counter that said I'd be back in a few days, and drove away. I needed space, distance, a chance to think without their voices filling every corner of my skull. As the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. A fragile, cautious sense of peace. The cabin was small and simple. One room with a bed, a wood stove, and a window that looked out over the water. No television, no phone signal. Just silence. I spent the first day doing nothing. I sat on the porch and watched the light change on the lake. I made simple meals. I read a book I'd been meaning to finish for months. And for the first time since they'd arrived, I slept through the night without waking to voices or footsteps or the feeling that I was suffocating. On the second day, I went for a long walk through the woods. The air was cool and smelled like pine and earth. Birds called from the branches above. My footsteps crunched on fallen leaves. And somewhere in the rhythm of walking, in the quiet of the trees, I started to think clearly. I realized that I'd been living in a state of paralysis, waiting for something to change, waiting for my daughter to notice, waiting for Gerald and Marjorie to magically become considerate. But nothing was going to change unless I made it change. The question was how, and what I was willing to risk. By the third morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and drove home. The closer I got, the tighter my chest felt. But I didn't turn around. I kept driving, hands steady on the wheel, rehearsing in my head what I was going to say. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something immediately. The lawn had been mowed, badly. Uneven strips, patches missed entirely. And there were flowers planted in the garden. Not in neat rows. Just scattered randomly bright tulips and daisies shoved into the soil where my vegetables had been. My jaw clenched. I got out of the car and walked toward the house, my footsteps heavy. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside and stopped. The living room had been rearranged again. The couch was against a different wall. A new rug covered the floor. My bookshelf, the one I'd built by hand, had been moved to the hallway. And sitting on the coffee table was a stack of mail. My mail, opened, read, some of it crumpled like trash. I heard laughter from the kitchen. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my ears. Gerald was at the table eating a sandwich. Marjorie was at the stove stirring something in a pot. The kids were in the living room watching cartoons on a television that was now mounted on the wall. My wall, with holes drilled into it. Gerald looked up and grinned. "Hey, you're back. We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost." He laughed. "How was your trip?" I didn't answer. I walked over to the counter and picked up one of the opened envelopes. A bill. My electric bill. "You opened my mail." Marjorie glanced over her shoulder. "Oh, that. Yeah, we weren't sure if it was important. Didn't want anything to get missed while you were gone." "It's illegal to open someone else's mail," I said quietly. She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, come on. We're family." "You're not my family." The words came out harder than I intended. The kitchen went silent. Gerald stopped chewing. Marjorie turned around slowly, wooden spoon in hand, her expression shifting from casual to sharp. "Excuse me?" she said. I set the envelope down and looked at her, at both of them. "You're not my family. You're my daughter's in-laws, and this is my house, my mail, my garden, my space, and I didn't give you permission to change any of it." Gerald stood up, his face darkening. "Now wait just a minute. We've been helping out around here, keeping the place up while you were off on vacation." "I didn't ask for your help," I said. "I didn't ask for any of this." Marjorie's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Gerald, then back at me. "We were just trying to make things nicer. We thought you'd appreciate it." "You thought wrong." The air between us was thick and electric. Gerald's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You know what? We don't have to stay here. We were doing you a favor, keeping you company. Old man living alone in this big house. We thought you'd be grateful." "Grateful?" I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. "You've taken over my home. You've thrown out my things. You destroyed my garden. You treat me like I'm invisible. And you want me to be grateful?" "We've been nothing but respectful," Marjorie snapped. "You put my wife's photo in a drawer," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "You tore up plants I'd been growing for years. You opened my private mail. That's not respect. That's invasion." Gerald stepped forward, his face red. "Listen here. Your daughter invited us. If you have a problem, take it up with her." "I will." He stared at me, jaw working, and for a moment I thought he might actually swing. But instead, he grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and stormed toward the door. "Come on, Marjorie, we don't have to put up with this." Marjorie hesitated, her face pale, then followed him. The kids scrambled after them, confused and scared. The door slammed so hard the windows rattled. I stood there in the sudden silence, my heart hammering, my hands shaking. I walked over to the window and watched them load into their car, watched them drive away. And I waited for the relief to come. But it didn't. Instead, I felt a creeping dread, because I knew what was coming next. 20 minutes later, my daughter's car screeched into the driveway. She got out and stormed toward the house, her face twisted with fury. I met her at the door. "What did you do?" she shouted. "Gerald just called me. He said you kicked them out, told them they weren't welcome." "I told them the truth," I said calmly, "that this is my house, and they don't have the right to treat it like theirs. They were helping. They were trying to make things better. They were taking over, and you let them." Her eyes blazed. "I asked you for one thing, Dad. One thing. To let them stay here until they found a place, and you couldn't even do that." "You didn't ask," I said quietly. "You told me. You made a decision about my life without even consulting me. And then you left me to deal with the consequences." She opened her mouth, then closed it. For a second, I thought I saw something crack in her expression. Doubt. Maybe even guilt. But it hardened again just as fast. "You're being selfish." "Maybe I am," I said. "But it's my house, and I'm allowed to be selfish in my own home." She stared at me, breathing hard, and then she shook her head. I can't believe you. She turned and walked back to her car. Before she got in, she looked back at me, her eyes wet. You just chose a house over your own family. No, I said. You chose them over me. She got in the car and drove away. I stood in the doorway for a long time after she left, staring at the empty driveway, feeling the weight of what I'd just done settle over me like a stone. I walked back inside. The house was quiet again. My house. I looked around at the rearranged furniture, the holes in the wall, the flowers in the garden outside, and I started putting it back, one piece at a time. It took hours. I moved the couch back. I rehung my pictures. I pulled the flowers out of the garden and replanted what vegetables I could salvage. My back ached. My hands were sore. But with every piece I restored, I felt something return. Not happiness, not peace, but something close. Ownership, dignity, the sense that I still had a say in my own life. When I finally finished, I sat down in my chair, the one Gerald had claimed, and looked around. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars. But it was mine again. 3 days later, my daughter called. Her voice was quiet, strained. Gerald and Marjorie found an apartment. They're moving in next week. Good, I said. There was a long pause. Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't realize how hard this was on you. I thought I was helping everyone. But I wasn't listening to you. I closed my eyes. I know. Can we talk? In person? Yeah, I said. We can talk. She came over the next afternoon. We sat on the porch looking out at the garden. She cried a little. I held her hand. We didn't fix everything, but we started. And that was enough. In the end, I learned something I should have known all along. You can't pour from an empty cup. You can't help others if you've lost yourself. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set a boundary and stand firm, even when it costs you. Especially when it costs you. Because respect isn't given. It's earned. And it starts with respecting yourself. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and I'd be honored to share them with you.